The name card sat crooked on the white linen, placed so close to the swinging kitchen door that every time a server pushed through, the breeze made it wobble. Rebecca Foster reached for it slowly, turned it over once, then set it back down without comment. The calligraphy was beautiful, she had to admit that much, but there was something deliberate about where they had positioned her. 24 other place settings stretched down the long banquet table at the Harborview Restaurant, each one carefully arranged with a view of Casco Bay through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Hers faced the hallway to the restrooms. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Owen tugged gently at her sleeve. His 11-year-old face tilted up with that expression he got when he was trying to understand adult behavior without asking about it directly. She smoothed his collar and whispered that everything was fine, even though they both knew it probably wasn't. The private dining room hummed with polite conversation and the clink of wine glasses. String lights had been woven through the exposed beams overhead, casting a warm glow over tables decorated with small pumpkins and autumn leaves. It looked like a magazine spread, the kind of event someone would post about with hashtags about gratitude and success in family. Vanessa stood near the center of the room, radiant in a burgundy dress that probably cost more than Rebecca's monthly rent. She laughed loudly at something Craig said, touching his arm in that performative way people do when they want others to notice how connected they are. Her sister had always known how to command a room. Even as children, Vanessa had understood instinctively that volume and confidence could substitute for substance if you projected both with enough conviction. She caught Rebecca's eye across the room and waved, a small gesture that felt more like acknowledgement of an obligation than genuine warmth. Linda Foster materialized beside the table, scrutinizing the arrangement with the critical eye of someone who had spent decades staging homes for sale. She adjusted a fork, moved a water glass half an inch to the left, then noticed where Rebecca had been seated. For just a moment, something flickered across her face, guilt perhaps, or maybe just mild embarrassment. Then it vanished behind the practiced smile Rebecca had known her entire life. Her mother touched her shoulder briefly and said the restaurant must have made a mistake with the seating chart, though they both knew Vanessa had approved every detail personally. Linda moved away before Rebecca could respond, drawn back toward the center of the room where Vanessa was holding court with several people in expensive suits, who Rebecca assumed were her new colleagues from Aurora Digital Solutions. The server who brought bread to their end of the table apologized for bumping Rebecca's chair with his elbow. It was the third time someone had needed to squeeze past to reach the kitchen, and dinner hadn't even started yet. Owen broke off a piece of focaccia and ate it slowly, watching the room with those observant green eyes that never seemed to miss anything. He had his father's coloring but Rebecca's temperament, thank God. The divorce had been brutal, but at least David's vindictive streak had skipped a generation. Her son possessed a kindness that sometimes made her chest ache with protectiveness and pride in equal measure. Tom Foster sat near the head of the table, nursing a scotch and nodding along to whatever Craig was explaining with animated hand gestures. Her father had perfected the art of being physically present while remaining emotionally absent, a skill he had honed over decades of avoiding conflict in a household where her mother's moods could shift like weather patterns. Rebecca used to resent his passivity. Now she mostly felt a distant sort of pity for a man who had spent his entire life as a spectator in his own family. Across the table, Vanessa's colleague from Aurora Digital leaned back in her chair and said something about quarterly projections. The woman wore a blazer with the company logo subtly embroidered on the pocket, the kind of corporate branding that was meant to look casual, but actually cost a fortune to produce. Rebecca recognized the type. She had worked with dozens of them during her years at Meridian Consulting Group in Boston, back when she had an office with her name on the door, and a salary that let her afford more than a two-bedroom apartment in Portland's Old Port District. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. Sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep, Rebecca would scroll through her old LinkedIn profile and read the recommendations people had written about her leadership and strategic vision. VP of Operations before she turned 34. Fast-tracked for partner. Then David had decided that if he couldn't have her, he would make sure no one else could either, and suddenly all those carefully built professional relationships became minefields. She had left Meridian not because she wanted to, but because staying meant fighting battles on two fronts, and she only had enough energy to protect her son. The freelance consulting work paid the bills mostly. She had kept some of her smaller clients, the ones who valued her expertise more than office politics. Working from home meant she could pick Owen up from Deering Middle School every afternoon and actually be present for the homework struggles and the rambling stories about whatever drama had unfolded at lunch. It meant she could volunteer for field trips and make it to parent-teacher conferences without negotiating with an executive assistant about calendar conflicts. Her salary had dropped by more than half, but she had full custody and peace of mind, and most days that felt like enough. Vanessa had never asked about any of it. In the 4 years since Rebecca's divorce, her sister had maintained a carefully constructed ignorance about the details of Rebecca's life. She knew the broad strokes, the same information anyone could glean from a casual conversation at a holiday dinner, but she had never once asked what it actually felt like to rebuild everything from scratch. She had never asked if Rebecca was okay, or if she needed anything, or whether starting over at 34 with a 7-year-old felt as terrifying as it sounded. Instead, Vanessa had simply folded Rebecca's circumstances into her own narrative about choices and consequences, a story in which she herself emerged as the responsible sister who had made all the right decisions. The first course arrived, a butternut squash soup with pepitas and a drizzle of cream. Owen ate his carefully, trying not to spill on the white button-down shirt they had bought specifically for this dinner. Rebecca watched Vanessa stand and tap her wine glass with a fork, calling for everyone's attention. The room quieted gradually, conversations trailing off as faces turned toward the center of the table. Vanessa smiled broadly and launched into a speech about gratitude and hard work, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who believed in your vision. Rebecca forced herself to take another spoonful of soup. It was excellent, perfectly seasoned with just enough heat from white pepper to balance the sweetness of the squash. She focused on the food and tried not to calculate how much this private dining room was costing or wonder who was paying for it. Craig probably, which meant it was essentially Vanessa spending money she hadn't earned to celebrate a promotion she had probably exaggerated. Her sister had always been talented at spinning modest achievements into major victories, at making lateral moves sound like meteoric rises. When Vanessa finished her toast, the room erupted in polite applause. Linda raised her glass highest, her face glowing with maternal pride. Tom clapped along, steady and automatic. Several of the Aurora Digital employees exchanged knowing glances, the kind of look people share when they recognize that the enthusiasm is slightly disproportionate to the actual accomplishment, but are too polite to say so. Rebecca clapped too, because not clapping would be noticed and commented on later, and she was trying to get through this dinner without incident. The main course came and went. Owen ate his chicken and roasted vegetables without complaint, occasionally leaning against Rebecca's arm in that way he had of checking in without words. She felt a rush of love for this small person who somehow understood that she needed his presence more than his questions right now. Around them, conversations ebbed and flowed. People discussed vacation plans and real estate prices, and whether the Patriots had any chance this season. Normal dinner party talk, the social lubrication that kept events like this from feeling like the obligation they actually were. Rebecca excused herself to use the restroom, grateful for a moment alone. The bathroom was as elegant as the rest of the restaurant, all marble and brass fixtures with small vases of fresh flowers on the counter. She washed her hands slowly and looked at herself in the mirror. 38 looked different than she had imagined it would when she was younger. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes and a tiredness that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. But there was also something else. A steadiness maybe. A sense of having survived things and come out intact on the other side. She dried her hands and returned to the table. Dessert was being served when Vanessa stood again, this time without the wine glass announcement. She simply started talking, her voice pitched to carry across the room. She wanted to take a moment, she said, to acknowledge some special people. Her husband Craig, of course, who supported her ambitions. Her parents, who had always encouraged her to reach for more. Her team at Aurora Digital, who made every day exciting. The list went on, carefully curated, strategically inclusive. Rebecca knew what was coming before Vanessa's eyes landed on her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She could feel it building, the slight shift in energy that happens when someone is about to say something that masquerades as kindness but isn't. And of course my sister Rebecca, Vanessa said, her smile bright and sharp. Becca has always been the practical one in the family. Very grounded. She paused. And in that pause Rebecca heard everything that was about to follow. It's been inspiring to watch her adapt after everything that happened with her career. Not everyone can handle that kind of transition. The laughter started small, uncertain. From freelancing now, right, Becca? Working from home, doing your consulting thing. Vanessa's tone was light, conversational, but Rebecca felt Owen tense beside her. That takes a special kind of person, someone who is comfortable with a more modest lifestyle. The laughter grew louder now, more confident. Linda was smiling, nodding along as if Vanessa was simply stating facts rather than carefully dismantling Rebecca's dignity in front of 24 witnesses. Craig chuckled into his wine glass. Several of the Aurora Digital employees shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruelty but unwilling to disrupt the flow of the evening. Vanessa continued, gaining momentum. We all remember when Becca was the ambitious one, the one who was going to take the corporate world by storm. But life happens, relationships end, and sometimes we have to recalibrate our expectations. She looked directly at Rebecca now. It's nothing to be ashamed of, really. Someone has to be content with less so the rest of us can appreciate how far we've come. The room had gone quiet except for a few scattered nervous laughs. Rebecca felt her face flush, not with embarrassment but with a white-hot anger that she forced herself to contain. Owen's hand found hers under the table and squeezed. She squeezed back, a silent promise that she wouldn't make a scene, that she would protect him from witnessing his mother break in public. She pushed her chair back slowly, ready to gather her son and leave with whatever scraps of dignity she could salvage, when she heard another chair scrape loudly against the floor. A man stood near the center of the table, tall and commanding in a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive clothes do. Rebecca recognized him immediately even though his hair was grayer, and his face more lined than the last time she had seen him. James Mitchell looked older, more substantial, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence she remembered from 8 years ago, when he had been a junior analyst at Meridian, drowning in deadlines and struggling with demons he thought no one else could see. He walked toward their end of the table with deliberate steps, and the room seemed to hold its breath. James stopped beside Rebecca's chair and extended his hand. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "What a genuine surprise to see you here." She stood automatically, accepting the handshake, confused and not quite catching up to what was happening. James turned to address the room, his posture relaxed but authoritative. "For those who don't know, I'm James Mitchell, CEO of Aurora Digital Solutions." His gaze swept across the table, lingering briefly on Vanessa, whose face had gone pale. "And Rebecca Foster is quite possibly the most brilliant strategist I've ever had the privilege of learning from." The silence that followed James Mitchell's words felt thick enough to touch. Rebecca stood frozen, her hand still clasped in his, trying to process the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Around the table, faces registered varying degrees of confusion and curiosity. Vanessa had gone completely still, her wine glass suspended halfway to her lips, the confident smile from moments earlier, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. Craig leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from smug amusement to cautious interest. Linda's perfectly maintained composure flickered, just for a second, before she rearranged her features into polite attention. James released Rebecca's hand but remained standing beside her, his presence somehow both protective and casual. He seemed completely unaware of or perhaps entirely unconcerned with the tension radiating from Vanessa's end of the table. The CEO of Aurora Digital Solutions, Rebecca thought, still catching up. The company that had just promoted her sister. The same James Mitchell who used to show up at her office door at Meridian Consulting Group looking exhausted and desperate, asking if she had 5 minutes to help him understand why his data models kept failing. He turned slightly toward Owen, extending his hand to the boy with the same respect he had shown Rebecca. "You must be Rebecca's son. She mentioned you often back in the day." Owen shook his hand solemnly, the way Rebecca had taught him, and something about the gesture made her throat tighten. James looked back at her, and there was warmth in his expression that felt genuine, untainted by the corporate politeness that usually colored professional interactions. "How long has it been?" 7 years. 8? Rebecca managed, finding her voice. Her mind was racing, trying to connect the junior analyst she had mentored to the man standing before her in a suit that probably cost more than her monthly car payment. The last time she had seen James, he had been leaving Meridian for graduate school, armed with recommendation letters she had spent hours crafting because she believed in his potential even when he didn't believe in himself. They had lost touch after she left Boston. The way people do when life pulls them in different directions, and staying connected requires more energy than either person can spare. James seemed to sense her confusion and addressed the room again. His tone conversational but carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. I was a junior analyst at Meridian Consulting Group when Rebecca was VP of Operations. I was struggling both professionally and personally, and she took me under her wing when she had absolutely no obligation to do so. He paused, letting that sink in. She taught me everything I know about strategic thinking, about leading teams, about making decisions that balance profit with principles. Without her mentorship, I wouldn't be standing here today. Rebecca felt heat rising in her face, but this time it wasn't from anger or humiliation. She wasn't comfortable with public praise, had never been the type to seek spotlight or recognition. During her years at Meridian, she had been content to do excellent work and let results speak for themselves, a strategy that had served her well until it hadn't. She opened her mouth to deflect, to make some modest comment that would shift attention away from herself, but James continued before she could speak. When I started at Meridian, I was a mess. He said it plainly, without shame or dramatic emphasis, just stating a fact. I was brilliant with data but terrible with people. I worked 70-hour weeks because I couldn't stand to be alone with my thoughts. I was self-medicating in ways that were going to destroy me, and everyone at the firm either didn't notice or didn't care enough to intervene. Everyone except Rebecca. She noticed. She pulled me aside one day after I had botched a client presentation and told me that I was too talented to waste my life running from whatever I was afraid to face. The restaurant felt different now, the elegant autumn decorations and twinkling lights fading into background as James's words filled the space. Rebecca remembered that conversation, though she hadn't known until much later just how close to the edge he had been. She had seen the signs because she had learned to recognize them, having grown up with a mother whose moods could turn on invisible triggers, and a sister whose need for attention could manifest in increasingly reckless behavior. James had been drowning, and she had thrown him a rope without making him feel weak for needing one. She didn't just give me advice and send me on my way, James said. She met with me every Tuesday morning for 6 months, 7 a.m. before anyone else got to the office, because she knew I wouldn't accept help if it looked like charity or if other people were watching. She taught me how to build financial models that actually made sense, how to present to clients without letting my anxiety sabotage the message, how to manage my time so I wasn't using exhaustion as a coping mechanism. She recommended a therapist when I finally admitted I needed one, and she covered the first 3 sessions out of her own pocket when I was too proud to use my insurance. Rebecca had forgotten about that. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, $300 that she could afford to spare, and that he desperately needed. She hadn't told anyone about it, hadn't mentioned it in performance reviews, or used it to boost her own reputation as a mentor. It had simply been the right thing to do for someone who was trying to save their own life, but couldn't quite manage it alone. Looking at James now, successful and healthy and standing in a room full of his employees, she felt a delayed sense of satisfaction that her instincts about him had been correct. When I decided to leave Meridian for business school, Rebecca wrote my recommendation letters, James continued. She spent hours on them, not just filling in templates but crafting narratives that highlighted my strengths while being honest about areas where I still needed growth. She made calls on my behalf to people in her network, opened doors that I didn't even know existed. When I got accepted to Wharton, she took me to lunch and gave me a leather notebook with a single sentence written on the first page. Remember who you are when you forget why you started. I still have that notebook in my office. Around the table, people were listening with the kind of attention that comes from genuine interest rather than social obligation. Several of the Aurora Digital employees were nodding, as if this story confirmed things they had suspected about their CEO. Tom Foster was staring at Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between surprise and regret. Linda had set down her wine glass and was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. Vanessa looked like she wanted to interrupt, but couldn't figure out how to do so without making things worse. James turned back to Rebecca, And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more personal. "I lost touch with you after you left Meridian. I heard through the network that you had gone through a divorce and left Boston, but I didn't reach out because I was in the middle of building my first startup and I convinced myself I was too busy." He shook his head slightly. "That was cowardly. You had invested so much in my success, and when you needed support, I wasn't there. I've regretted that for years." Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. She had never blamed James for the silence after she left Boston. Their mentorship relationship had run its course, and she had been drowning in her own crisis, too overwhelmed to maintain connections that required emotional energy she didn't have to spare. But hearing him acknowledge it, hearing him name the absence and take responsibility for it, meant more than she could easily articulate. Owen was watching James with rapt attention, and Rebecca realized this was probably the first time her son had heard anyone speak about her professional life with this kind of respect. He knew she had worked in Boston before he was old enough to remember. He knew the divorce had changed things. But he had grown up in the aftermath, in the smaller apartment and the freelance hustle and the careful budgeting that meant saying no to school trips she couldn't quite afford. He had never seen her in the context James was describing, as someone who wielded influence and commanded respect, and changed lives through her competence and care. James addressed the room once more, his tone shifting back to something more formal, more CEO-like. "When I joined Aurora Digital Solutions 3 years ago, I built the company culture around principles Rebecca taught me. Mentorship matters. People matter more than quarterly earnings. Success without integrity is just well-compensated failure. Every executive at this company has heard me talk about the VP who saved my life by teaching me how to live differently. They all know that story, even if they didn't know her name until tonight." He looked directly at Vanessa now, and his expression was polite but cool. "I want to be very clear about something. Rebecca Foster is not someone who settled for less or whose career fell apart. She made a choice to prioritize her son and her well-being over a toxic situation that was destroying both. That's not failure. That's wisdom. And anyone who frames it differently is revealing their own limitations, not hers." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread across the table in expanding circles of realization. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Her carefully constructed narrative, the one in which she was the successful sister and Rebecca the cautionary tale, had just been dismantled by the one person in the room whose opinion could actually affect her career. Craig reached for her hand under the table, a gesture that looked more like damage control than comfort. James pulled out his phone and handed it to Rebecca. "I'd like your number if you're willing. Aurora is expanding our consulting division, and I could use someone with your expertise to help structure it." He smiled slightly. "I promise actual compensation this time. Not just coffee and life advice at 7 in the morning." The offer was professional, but the delivery was warm, an acknowledgement of their shared history without demanding anything in return. Rebecca took the phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she entered her contact information. This felt surreal, like something that happened in movies rather than real life. She handed the phone back and James glanced at the screen, nodded, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He turned to Owen and crouched slightly so they were at eye level. "Your mom is one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. I hope you already know that, but just in case she hasn't told you all the details, take it from someone who owes her everything. You should be incredibly proud." Owen nodded seriously, and Rebecca saw his shoulders straighten slightly, watched pride and understanding dawn across his face in equal measure. James stood, shook Rebecca's hand once more, and then turned to address Vanessa with careful politeness. "Congratulations on your promotion. I'm sure you've worked hard to get where you are." He let the words hang for just a moment before adding, "I look forward to seeing how you lead your team with the same integrity and generosity your sister modeled for me all those years ago." It was a challenge disguised as encouragement, and everyone at the table recognized it as such. James nodded to the room at large, wished everyone a pleasant evening, and walked toward the exit with the unhurried confidence of someone who had said exactly what he intended and felt no need to elaborate. The door closed behind him, and for several long seconds nobody moved. Then all at once the spell broke and conversations erupted in overlapping waves of confusion and excitement, and awkward attempts to pretend nothing unusual had just occurred. Rebecca sat down slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady. Owen pressed against her side and she wrapped an arm around his shoulders, anchoring herself to his solidity. Around them, people were leaning across the table to whisper to each other, casting glances in her direction that ranged from curious to apologetic to openly reassessing. One of the Aurora Digital employees, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes, caught Rebecca's gaze and mouthed, "I'm sorry." Rebecca nodded slightly, accepting the unspoken acknowledgement. Linda stood abruptly, her chair scraping loud against the floor, and announced that she needed some air. She left the dining room without looking at Rebecca, and Tom followed after a moment's hesitation, his face troubled. Vanessa remained frozen in her seat, staring at the centerpiece arrangement as if it held answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Craig was scrolling through his phone, probably searching for James Mitchell's LinkedIn profile to confirm what had just happened, to verify that the CEO of Aurora Digital Solutions had indeed just publicly endorsed his wife's struggling freelance consultant sister, while politely eviscerating Vanessa's character. The servers returned to clear dessert plates, moving with practiced efficiency through the awkward atmosphere. Rebecca accepted a refill of water and drank it slowly, giving herself something to do with her hands. She felt Owen's fingers lace through hers under the table, a steady pressure that reminded her to breathe. The dinner was supposed to continue with coffee and after-dinner drinks, but people were beginning to make excuses about early mornings and babysitters and traffic. Within 15 minutes, the private dining room that had felt so carefully orchestrated was emptying in clusters of 2s and 3s. Danny Foster, Rebecca's cousin, approached their table hesitantly. He was younger by 8 years, close enough in age that they had played together as children but distant enough that they had never been truly close. He had always been the family peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and find middle ground even when middle ground meant asking someone to accept less than they deserved. He pulled out the chair across from Rebecca and sat without asking permission. "That was intense," he said, aiming for casual and missing. Rebecca waited, knowing there was more coming. "Look, Vanessa was out of line tonight, I get that. But you know how she gets sometimes. She doesn't always think before she speaks." He was treading carefully, testing to see if Rebecca would make this easy for him by agreeing, by accepting the implicit suggestion that Vanessa's cruelty was just thoughtlessness rather than deliberate malice. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Danny, Vanessa has been getting away with not thinking before she speaks for her entire life. At some point we have to acknowledge that someone who consistently says cruel things in public maybe isn't just careless. Maybe that's who she actually is." The words came out more tired than angry, a simple statement of observable fact. Danny shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, yeah, but family is family, right? You two have always been competitive. Maybe this is just like a communication style thing that got out of hand." He was working hard to find a frame that would make this Rebecca's responsibility to fix, a perspective that would let everyone move on without Vanessa having to actually reckon with what she had done. Owen spoke before Rebecca could formulate a response. His voice was quiet but clear, and both adults turned to look at him in surprise. Aunt Vanessa wasn't competing with Mom tonight. She was just being mean. And then that man came and told everyone the truth, and now Aunt Vanessa is embarrassed because everyone knows she was wrong. That's not a communication problem. That's just what happens when you're mean to people and someone finally notices. The simplicity of Owen's analysis hung in the air between them. Danny opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. He looked at Rebecca as if hoping she would contradict her son, would soften the assessment into something more palatable. She didn't. After a long uncomfortable moment, Danny stood and mumbled something about checking on Linda. He left quickly, eager to escape the accountability that Owen's words demanded. Rebecca pulled Owen closer and kissed the top of his head. "Thank you," she whispered, "for telling the truth." He leaned into her embrace and said nothing, but she felt him relax slightly, satisfied that he had protected her in the way she had always protected him. They sat together in the increasingly empty dining room, watching servers fold napkins and collect stray wine glasses, waiting for the moment when it would be appropriate to leave without seeming like they were fleeing. Vanessa stood eventually, Craig hovering at her elbow like an anxious handler. She walked toward Rebecca's end of the table with visible reluctance, each step looking like it required conscious effort. When she reached them, she stopped a careful distance away, Too far for casual conversation but close enough that her words wouldn't carry to the remaining guests. Her face was flushed. Whether from wine or humiliation Rebecca couldn't tell. "I didn't know you knew James Mitchell," Vanessa said, and her voice carried an accusation, as if Rebecca had deliberately withheld information that Vanessa was entitled to possess. It wasn't quite an apology, wasn't even close, but it was the nearest thing to acknowledgement that Rebecca was likely to receive. She could see her sister struggling with the situation, trying to find an angle that would let her maintain the narrative she had built, while accounting for the reality that James had just revealed. "We lost touch years ago," Rebecca said evenly. "I had no idea he was your CEO until about 10 minutes ago." She kept her voice neutral, refusing to give Vanessa anything that could be twisted into drama or defensiveness. Owen watched his aunt with the kind of careful attention children develop when they need to track adults who might be unpredictable, and Rebecca felt a pang of sadness that her son had learned this particular skill. Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Well, it was still inappropriate for him to say all that in front of my colleagues. This was supposed to be my night, my celebration, and he made it about you." The self-pity in her voice was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. She genuinely seemed to believe that she was the wronged party here, that James's intervention had been an unprovoked attack rather than a direct response to her public cruelty. Rebecca felt something settle inside her, a final understanding clicking into place. This was who her sister was. Not temporarily thoughtless, not stressed by the demands of success, not struggling with insecurities that manifested as cruelty. Just fundamentally unable to see past her own wants and needs long enough to recognize when she had caused harm. And Rebecca was done trying to help her learn. "Vanessa," Rebecca said quietly, "I didn't ask James to say any of that. I didn't even know he was here. You made this about me when you decided to mock my career and my life choices in front of a room full of people." He just corrected the record. The steadiness in her own voice surprised her. There was no anger, no hurt. Just a flat statement of sequence and consequence. Her sister stared at her for a long moment, searching for something in Rebecca's expression that she didn't find. Then she turned and walked away without another word, Craig trailing behind her like a shadow. They collected Linda and Tom from the bar area and left as a unit, the Foster family -2, off to debrief and construct a version of events that would let them maintain their preferred story. Rebecca watched them go and felt nothing but a distant sense of relief. The restaurant manager appeared at their table, apologetic and professional. She explained that the bill had already been settled, thanks to Mr. Mitchell, who had stopped at the bar on his way out to cover not just his drink but the entire evening's expenses. Rebecca started to protest, to say that wasn't necessary, but the manager smiled gently and said he had been very insistent. He had apparently also left a substantial tip for the serving staff with instructions to take particularly good care of the woman and boy at the end table. Owen looked up at Rebecca with wonder in his eyes. "Mom, is he really that rich?" She laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "I guess so, buddy. But more importantly, he's that grateful. There's a difference." They gathered their coats and walked through the restaurant, past tables where normal dinners were happening, where families and couples sat together without drama or revelation or the spectacular collapse of carefully maintained pretenses. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, carrying the salt smell of Casco Bay. The parking lot was mostly empty now, just their modest Honda sedan and a few other cars scattered across the spaces. Rebecca unlocked the doors and helped Owen with his seatbelt, even though he was old enough to manage it himself. She needed the moment of routine care, the familiar motion of protecting her child in small ordinary ways. She sat in the driver's seat, but didn't start the engine immediately. Her hands rested on the steering wheel and she stared out at the dark water visible beyond the parking lot, lights from boats bobbing in the distance. Owen was quiet in the back seat, giving her space to process. After several minutes he spoke softly. "Are you okay?" She met his eyes in the rearview mirror and found herself smiling, a real smile this time, not the careful mask she had worn all evening. "Yeah," she said, and meant it. "I really am." The apartment was quiet when they arrived home, the kind of peaceful silence that felt earned rather than empty. Rebecca kicked off her heels in the entryway and padded into the small kitchen to make tea while Owen changed into his pajamas. Their two-bedroom place in the Old Port District wasn't much, but it had tall windows that let in good light and hardwood floors that creaked in friendly ways. She had painted the walls herself when they first moved in, choosing warm colors that made the space feel cozy rather than cramped. A stranger might see it as a downgrade from the life she used to have, but Rebecca had learned to measure wealth differently. Owen appeared in flannel pants and an oversized t-shirt from some coding camp he had attended last summer. His hair still damp from a quick shower. He climbed onto one of the mismatched bar stools at their small kitchen counter and watched her pour hot water over chamomile tea bags. She added honey to his mug the way he liked it and slid it across to him carefully. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, letting the evening's events settle into something they could examine without immediate emotion. "Mom," Owen said finally, "why did Aunt Vanessa say those things about you?" His question was genuine curiosity rather than accusation, the way children ask about weather patterns or why certain foods taste the way they do. Rebecca wrapped her hands around her own mug and considered how to answer honestly without burdening him with adult complications he shouldn't have to carry. "I think your aunt has always felt like we were in competition, even though I never saw it that way. She measured her success by comparing it to other people's situations, and when my life changed after the divorce, it made her feel better about her own choices. Tonight she said those things because having an audience made her feel powerful, and putting someone else down is the easiest way to feel big when you're actually feeling small inside." Owen absorbed this, frowning slightly. "But you're not a failure. You help people with their businesses and you're always working on your computer, and those people send you thank you emails that you save in a special folder." He had seen more than she realized, had been paying attention to the shape of her days in ways that reminded her he was growing up faster than she sometimes wanted to acknowledge. Rebecca felt her throat tighten with love for this observant, thoughtful boy who somehow understood things that adults twice his age couldn't grasp. "You're right. I'm not a failure. I made choices that were right for us even though other people might not understand them. Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is letting go of what other people think you should want and just focusing on what actually matters. Like us being together after school," Owen said. "And you not being stressed all the time like you used to be when I was little." He said it matter-of-factly, confirming something he had noticed years ago. Rebecca had tried to shield him from the worst of it during the divorce and the immediate aftermath, but children absorb things through their skin, picked up on tensions and anxieties that adults thought they were hiding successfully. "Exactly like that," Rebecca confirmed. She reached across the counter and ruffled his hair gently. "The man who came over tonight, Mr. Mitchell, he understood something important. Success isn't just about money or titles or impressing people. It's about becoming someone you're proud to be, and helping other people along the way. He remembered that I helped him when he needed it, and he wanted to make sure everyone knew I mattered." Owen nodded slowly, processing. "Are you going to work for his company?" The question held hope, not because he understood the professional implications, but because he had heard respect in James Mitchell's voice and wanted more people to speak about his mother that way. Rebecca smiled and shook her head slightly. "I don't know yet. He mentioned consulting work, which might be a good fit. But I'm not making any decisions tonight. Tonight we're just going to finish our tea and go to bed and be glad that we have each other." She stood and carried their empty mugs to the sink, rinsing them carefully and setting them in the dish drainer. Owen hugged her goodnight and shuffled off to his room, and she heard the soft sound of his door clicking shut. Rebecca moved to the small desk in the corner of the living room where her laptop sat surrounded by stacks of folders and notebooks. She opened the computer and stared at the screen without really seeing it, her mind replaying the evening in fragmented pieces. Vanessa's voice dripping with false concern. Linda's tight smile. The weight of being erased in real time. Then James standing up, his words cutting through the carefully constructed lies with the simple power of witnessed truth. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "This is James Mitchell. I got your number from the contact info you entered earlier. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out tonight. I wanted to apologize if I put you in an uncomfortable position. That wasn't my intention, but I realized showing up in the middle of your family dinner and making speeches probably wasn't ideal timing." Rebecca read the message twice, then typed back slowly. "You have nothing to apologize for. Thank you for what you said tonight. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to acknowledge the truth until you did it." She hesitated, then added, "And congratulations on Aurora Digital. I'd heard the name but didn't make the connection until tonight. What you've built is impressive." The response came quickly. "What I've built is a direct result of what you taught me. Everything I know about ethical leadership, about building teams that actually function, about making decisions that consider human cost and not just profit margins, I learned from watching you operate at Meridian. You were dealing with impossible situations and impossible people, and you never compromised your principles. That stayed with me. Rebecca felt something warm spread through her chest, a validation that reached deeper than James probably realized. During her years at Meridian, she had often felt alone in her approach, surrounded by colleagues who saw employees as resources to be optimized and clients as revenue sources to be maximized. She had fought small battles daily to maintain humanity in systems designed to strip it away, and she had lost more often than she won. Knowing that someone had been watching, had been learning, that her efforts had planted seeds that grew into something substantial, it mattered more than she could easily express. They texted back and forth for nearly an hour, catching up on the 8 years that had passed since they last spoke. James filled her in on the business school years, the startup he had built and sold, the opportunity to join Aurora Digital as CEO when the founders decided they needed someone with his operational expertise. He asked about her consulting work, and she found herself being more honest than she usually was about the challenges of rebuilding a career from scratch while raising a child alone. The consulting pays the bills, but it's isolating sometimes, she wrote. I miss collaborating with a team, miss the energy of building something bigger than individual projects. But flexibility matters more than prestige right now, and I've gotten comfortable with that trade-off. Most days. What if you didn't have to trade off? James's response came after a longer pause. I meant what I said about Aurora expanding our consulting division. We need someone to structure it, someone who understands both the strategic side and the human side. It would be contract work initially, could be done mostly remote with occasional trips to our office in Portland. Near your place actually, we're in the Arts District building near Arabica Cafe. Rebecca stared at the message. The offer was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit. Working with James again, helping build something from the ground up, having the structure and support of a team while maintaining the flexibility she needed for Owen. But she had learned to be cautious about opportunities that sounded too good, had trained herself to look for catches and complications before letting hope take root. Can I think about it? She wrote back. Not because I'm not interested, but because I've learned to make major decisions slowly. James's response was immediate. Of course. Take whatever time you need. The offer stands regardless, and there's no pressure. I owe you several years' worth of patience, so I'm happy to return the favor. They said goodnight and Rebecca closed her laptop, but sleep felt distant. She moved to the couch and pulled a blanket over herself, staring at the ceiling and thinking about paths not taken and bridges she thought had burned but maybe had just been waiting for the right moment to rebuild. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call rather than a text. Linda's name appeared on the screen. Rebecca considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. She answered and her mother's voice came through tight with controlled anger. That was humiliating tonight. For all of us, but especially for your sister. Linda didn't bother with greetings or pretense, just launched directly into accusation. She didn't wait for Rebecca to respond before continuing. Vanessa worked incredibly hard for that promotion, and you let that man ruin her celebration. The accusation was so absurd that Rebecca almost laughed. She kept her voice level when she replied. I let him. Mom, I had no idea James was going to be there. I haven't spoken to him in 8 years. He responded to what Vanessa said about me, which was cruel and uncalled for. I didn't orchestrate anything. Linda made a dismissive sound. Vanessa was just making conversation, trying to include you. You've always been too sensitive. The revisionism was breathtaking in its completeness. In Linda's version of events, Vanessa had been generous and Rebecca had overreacted, and the fact that 24 witnesses could confirm otherwise apparently didn't matter. Rebecca felt the familiar exhaustion that came from arguing with someone who had already decided which story to believe. Mom, she said carefully, Vanessa mocked my career, my life, my choices, in front of a room full of people. She implied I was a failure and laughed about it. That wasn't conversation, that was cruelty. And James didn't ruin anything. He just told the truth about our professional history. If that embarrassed Vanessa, maybe she should examine why hearing the truth felt like an attack. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Linda spoke again, her voice had shifted, less angry and more calculated. Well, regardless of intentions, the situation is what it is now. Vanessa is very upset. I think it would be appropriate for you to call her and smooth things over. Family is family, Rebecca. We work through difficulties, we don't air them in public. Rebecca closed her eyes and counted to 5 before responding. I'm not calling Vanessa to apologize for being humiliated. If she wants to talk about what happened, she knows how to reach me. But I'm done pretending that her behavior is acceptable, just because acknowledging it makes everyone uncomfortable. She could hear Linda's sharp intake of breath, the preparation for a longer argument, but Rebecca continued before her mother could launch into it. I need to go. It's late and Owen has school tomorrow. We can talk another time. She ended the call before Linda could respond and immediately silenced her phone. The apartment felt even quieter now, as if the conversation had sucked sound out of the air. Rebecca sat with the silence for a while, letting it settle around her like a familiar coat. This was the part her family never understood, that sometimes the hardest choice was also the healthiest one, that walking away from toxicity wasn't weakness but wisdom. Her laptop was still on the desk, the screensaver showing a photo of Owen at Bug Light Park, grinning at the camera with the lighthouse visible behind him. They had gone there last spring on one of the first truly warm days, brought a picnic lunch and spent hours just being together without schedule or obligation. Rebecca had taken that photo in a moment when he wasn't posing, when his joy was completely unself-conscious and real. She looked at it now and felt certainty settle in her bones. This was what mattered. Not Vanessa's approval or Linda's version of peace. Not titles or corner offices or salaries that looked impressive on paper. Just this boy and his genuine smile and the life they had built together from the wreckage of what came before. Everything else was negotiable. Rebecca opened her laptop again and composed an email to James, more formal than their text exchange had been. She thanked him again for his support at the dinner, and expressed genuine interest in learning more about the consulting opportunity. She outlined her constraints clearly, the hours she couldn't work because of Owen's schedule, the flexibility she would need for school events and emergencies. She was honest about her salary requirements and timeline for making decisions. Then she sent it before she could second-guess herself and close the computer with a sense of having done something important. Sleep came more easily after that. She fell asleep on the couch with the blanket tucked around her, and the photo of Owen still glowing softly on the screen across the room. She dreamed of standing at the edge of Casco Bay watching boats move across dark water, their lights tracing paths through the waves. In the dream she wasn't afraid of the distance or the depth, just curious about where the lights were headed, and what might be waiting on the far shore. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the apartment windows. Rebecca woke stiff from sleeping on the couch but more rested than she had felt in months. She made coffee and started breakfast, moving through the familiar routine of getting Owen ready for school. He appeared looking more awake than most 11-year-olds on a Monday morning, clearly still processing the events of the previous evening. Are we going to see Aunt Vanessa again? He asked around a mouthful of cereal. Rebecca poured herself coffee and considered the question carefully. She had learned not to make promises about family relationships because people were unpredictable and children remembered commitments that adults forgot. Probably eventually, she said. But maybe not for a while. Sometimes people need space to figure things out. He nodded as if this made perfect sense to him, and they finished breakfast in companionable quiet. She drove him to Deering Middle School and watched him disappear into the building with his backpack slung over one shoulder, already talking to friends about something that made them all laugh. Rebecca drove to Arabica Cafe, the coffee shop James had mentioned in his text. It was a place she came to sometimes when working from home felt too isolated. A converted warehouse space with exposed brick and mismatched furniture, and coffee that was genuinely excellent. She ordered a latte and claimed a table near the windows, opening her laptop to start the day's work. A contract review for a small manufacturing company, a strategy memo for a nonprofit trying to scale their operations, emails to return and invoices to send. She was deep into analyzing financial projections when someone stopped beside her table. She looked up expecting a barista asking if she needed anything else, but instead found herself looking at a woman about her age wearing an Aurora Digital Solutions jacket. The woman smiled hesitantly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you Rebecca Foster? I was at the dinner last night. I work in marketing at Aurora. Rebecca gestured to the empty chair across from her, and the woman sat, introducing herself as Patricia Chun from the brand strategy team. She explained that she had started at Aurora 6 months earlier and had heard James talk about his mentor from his early career, but had never connected that person to the woman whose sister had just been promoted to senior director. The way Patricia said it made clear she understood the irony of the situation. What James said last night really resonated with our whole team, Patricia said. We've been talking about it all morning in our group chat. The company culture at Aurora is different from other places I've worked, and hearing James explain where it came from, it made a lot of things click into place. She paused, seeming to gather courage. I also wanted to apologize if anyone on our team made you feel uncomfortable during dinner. We were invited as Vanessa's colleagues, but none of us knew there was family tension. Rebecca appreciated the gesture more than Patricia probably realized. You have nothing to apologize for. You were guests at what was supposed to be a celebration. What happened wasn't your responsibility. She took a sip of her latte and decided to ask the question that had been nagging at her since the previous evening. What's Vanessa like to work with? I'm curious if I'm missing something. If maybe the person she is professionally is different from who she is with family. Patricia's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. She clearly wanted to be diplomatic, but also seemed to value honesty. She's competent at her job, very good with clients and presentations, but she takes credit for collaborative work pretty frequently. There have been a few situations where ideas that came from team brainstorming sessions ended up in her reports with no attribution. Nothing egregious enough to escalate formally, but enough that people have noticed. The description matched Rebecca's understanding of her sister perfectly. Vanessa had always been skilled at positioning herself strategically, at being visible when things went well and absent when they didn't. It was a survival skill their mother had modeled, and Vanessa had perfected it into an art form. Rebecca thanked Patricia for her honesty, and they talked for a few more minutes about the consulting work James had mentioned, with Patricia offering insights into what the company actually needed versus what executives sometimes thought they needed. After Patricia left, Rebecca returned to her work but found her concentration fractured. She kept thinking about the conversation, about the pattern of behavior that followed Vanessa across contexts. It wasn't just family dynamics or sibling rivalry. It was a consistent approach to relationships that prioritized personal advancement over collective success. And based on what James had said and the way the other Aurora employees had reacted, that approach was becoming visible in ways that might eventually have professional consequences. Her phone rang, and this time it was Tom, her father. She answered cautiously, bracing for another version of Linda's accusations. But Tom's voice when he spoke was quieter than usual, almost tentative. I wanted to call and say that what happened last night wasn't okay. The way Vanessa talked about you, the things she said, they weren't true and they weren't fair. I should have said something right then instead of just sitting there. Rebecca felt surprise ripple through her. Her father had never been the type to wade into conflict, had spent decades perfecting the art of neutrality that allowed him to avoid taking sides in family disputes. Hearing him acknowledge not just what happened but his own failure to respond, it meant something. Thank you for saying that, she said simply. It helps to know you saw it too. Tom was quiet for a moment before continuing. Your mother called me this morning very upset about what James Mitchell said. She wants me to talk to you about smoothing things over with Vanessa. But I told her I wasn't going to do that. What needs smoothing is Vanessa's behavior, not your response to it. Rebecca heard him take a breath. I've watched you work twice as hard as your sister your whole life and get half the recognition. I've watched Linda make excuses for Vanessa and ignore your accomplishments. I've stayed quiet because keeping peace seemed important. But last night showed me that keeping false peace just enables cruelty. The words landed with unexpected weight. Rebecca had long ago stopped expecting her father to defend her, had accepted his passivity as a permanent condition of their relationship. Hearing him name the pattern, claim responsibility for his silence, and commit to changing it felt almost surreal. She didn't know what to say that would adequately convey what his call meant, so she settled for simplicity. I appreciate you calling. That means more than you probably realize. They talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics, Owen's school and Tom's golf league and the weather turning colder. When they hung up, Rebecca sat staring at her laptop screen without seeing it. 2 conversations in one morning that challenged her assumptions about how people saw her and what they might be willing to acknowledge. It felt like something shifting beneath the surface, Tectonic plates of family dynamics grinding against each other in ways that might eventually reshape the landscape. The weeks that followed the dinner unfolded with a strange sort of quiet that felt both peaceful and provisional, like the stillness between storms when you can't quite tell if the weather has truly passed or is simply gathering strength. Rebecca met with James twice more, once over coffee at Arabica, and once at Aurora Digital's offices in the Arts District, touring the space and meeting some of the team members who would be involved in the consulting division expansion. The offices occupied the top 2 floors of a renovated textile factory, all exposed brick and steel beams and windows that flooded the space with natural light. It reminded her of Meridian in some ways, the energy of people building something they believed in, but without the undercurrent of cutthroat competition that had made her old firm feel more like a battlefield than a workplace. James walked her through the vision for the consulting arm with genuine enthusiasm, explaining how Aurora had grown rapidly enough that clients were asking for implementation support beyond just the software solutions they provided. They needed someone who could bridge the gap between technical capability and organizational reality, who understood that the hardest part of any transformation wasn't the technology, but the people. Someone who could train their consultants not just in methodology, but in the kind of ethical framework that would differentiate Aurora's approach from the extraction model most consulting firms operated on. Rebecca listened and asked questions and felt something stirring in her that she had thought might be permanently dormant. An excitement about professional challenges that went beyond paying bills and keeping her schedule flexible. They discussed compensation and she was startled by the number James proposed, nearly double what she was currently cobbling together from her various freelance contracts. The role would be structured as a senior consulting position with leadership responsibilities, 30 hours a week to start with the possibility of expanding if things went well. She could work from home 3 days a week and come into the office 2 days. And James made it clear that Owen's schedule would always take priority over meetings that could be rescheduled. "I need a few days to think about it," Rebecca told him, even though she already knew her answer. She had learned through hard experience not to make major decisions in the moment, no matter how appealing they seemed. James nodded and said he would send over a formal offer letter with all the details in writing so she could review it carefully. They shook hands and Rebecca left the Aurora offices feeling something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of possibility that wasn't weighed down by fear of what might be taken away. That evening she picked Owen up from school, and they stopped at the grocery store, stocking up on essentials and the particular brand of granola bars he was currently obsessed with. As they loaded bags into the car, Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from a number she recognized as Vanessa's. "We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow afternoon?" The message was terse, no greeting or context, just a demand presented as a question. Rebecca stared at the text while Owen buckled himself into the back seat. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to maintain the silence that had settled between them like a protective barrier. But another part, the part that still carried some residual hope for reconciliation even after everything, thought maybe enough time had passed for Vanessa to have gained some perspective. She texted back a neutral response agreeing to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of them would have home field advantage. They met the next day at a place called Speckled Axe, a coffee roastery near the waterfront that was usually busy enough to provide ambient noise, but not so crowded that private conversations were impossible. Rebecca arrived first and claimed a table near the back, ordering a black coffee and settling in to wait. Vanessa appeared 15 minutes late, wearing a tailored blazer and designer jeans, her hair perfectly styled and her makeup camera ready even though this was just a Tuesday afternoon coffee meeting. She sat down across from Rebecca without ordering anything, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Vanessa's expression was hard to read, something between defiance and uncertainty, as if she had rehearsed what she wanted to say but was now questioning whether her script would survive contact with reality. Rebecca waited, having learned long ago that the person who speaks first in a confrontation usually reveals more than they intend. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the dinner," Vanessa said finally. Her voice was measured, careful, nothing like the performative warmth she used in public settings. "What James Mitchell said about you, about your history together, it caught me off guard. I didn't know you had that kind of impact on someone's career." Rebecca noted the phrasing, the way Vanessa framed it as surprise rather than acknowledging what she had said that prompted James's intervention. "You never asked about my career," Rebecca said quietly. "Not at Meridian, not after I left Boston, not when I started consulting. You had assumptions about what my life looked like and you never checked to see if those assumptions were accurate. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Rebecca continued, keeping her voice level. What you said at your dinner wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. You deliberately tried to humiliate me in front of a room full of people because it made you feel superior. That's not something I can just overlook because enough time has passed. Vanessa looked down at the table, tracing the wood grain with one finger. I know I was harsh. The admission came. Reluctantly, dragged out like a tooth that had to be pulled. But you have to understand, you've always had this way of making everything about you. Even when it's supposed to be my moment, somehow the attention shifts to you. It happened at the dinner and it's been happening our entire lives. Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach, recognition of just how differently they had experienced the same history. In Vanessa's version of their shared past, Rebecca was the one who monopolized attention and made everything about herself. The cognitive distortion was so complete, so resistant to contrary evidence, that Rebecca realized no amount of conversation was going to bridge the gap. They weren't disagreeing about facts, they were living in fundamentally different realities. Vanessa, I spent most of my adult life trying to make you look good. I gave up opportunities so you could shine. I covered for you when you made mistakes. I literally paid for things you needed and never asked to be repaid. And through all of it, you resented me because somewhere in your mind, my existence was a threat to your success. The words came out tired rather than angry, a simple statement of observable patterns. I can't fix how you see our relationship because it's not based on what actually happened, it's based on a story you tell yourself to justify treating me poorly. Vanessa's head snapped up, color rising in her cheeks. That's not fair. You don't know what it was like growing up in your shadow, always being compared to you, always being told that Rebecca did it this way or Rebecca handled it better. Mom held you up as the standard I could never meet. The pain in her voice sounded genuine, and Rebecca felt a flicker of sympathy despite everything. But then Vanessa continued and the moment dissolved. So yes, maybe I enjoyed seeing you struggle for once. Maybe it felt like things were finally balancing out. Is that really so terrible? Rebecca stood up slowly, gathering her coat and bag. The clarity that washed over her was almost physical. A lifting of obligation she hadn't realized she was still carrying. I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Vanessa. But I'm done trying to help you find it at my expense. She walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, leaving her sister sitting alone at the table with whatever justification she had prepared dissolving in the space between them. The conversation left Rebecca feeling strangely light rather than heavy. She had gone into it with some small hope that Vanessa might surprise her, might demonstrate growth or remorse or at least curiosity about perspectives beyond her own. The absence of those things was disappointing but also clarifying. She wasn't giving up on her sister out of spite or anger, she was simply accepting what had always been true, that some relationships were never going to become what you hoped they might be, and continuing to pour energy into them was just choosing to stay wounded. She drove to Owen's school and sat in the pickup line watching parents chat with each other, while they waited for the dismissal bell. Some of them she recognized from various school events, friendly acquaintances who waved or stopped to share quick updates about their kids' activities. She had worried when they first moved to Portland that she wouldn't be able to build community, that starting over would mean permanent isolation. But slowly, quietly, without the drama of her family relationships, she had accumulated connections with people who showed up consistently and treated her with basic decency. It wasn't the deep intimacy of lifelong friendship, but it was real and it was enough. Owen appeared with his usual cluster of friends, talking animatedly about something that required extensive hand gestures. He said goodbye to the others and climbed into the car, tossing his backpack onto the floor, and launching immediately into a detailed explanation of an argument that had broken out during recess about whether a hot dog counted as a sandwich. Rebecca listened with genuine interest to his reasoning, grateful for a child who still believed that some debates could be resolved through careful application of logic and evidence. That evening after dinner, she reviewed the formal offer letter from Aurora Digital one more time. The terms were clear and fair, the scope of work exciting without being overwhelming, the flexibility genuine rather than performative. She thought about what accepting would mean, the shift from piecing together contracts to having institutional support, the chance to build something sustainable rather than just surviving month to month. She thought about what James had said about her impact on his career, and wondered if maybe she had more to offer than she had been allowing herself to believe. Rebecca opened her laptop and composed an acceptance email, professional and enthusiastic but not desperate. She outlined her start date preference and confirmed her understanding of the initial project scope. Before she could second-guess herself, she hit send and closed the computer with a sense of having committed to something that felt like moving forward, rather than just treading water. Her phone rang almost immediately and James's name appeared on the screen. "I was hoping you would say yes," he said without preamble when she answered. His voice carried genuine pleasure rather than professional relief. "I've already started telling people about you joining the team, and they're excited to work with someone who has your background. We're planning a small welcome lunch next week if that works for your schedule. Nothing formal, just a chance for everyone to meet you in a relaxed setting." They talked through logistics and timing, and James mentioned casually that Patricia Chun had specifically requested to be assigned to Rebecca's initial project team. Apparently word had spread quickly through Aurora about the dinner incident and its aftermath, and Rebecca's stock had risen considerably among employees who valued the kind of leadership culture James was trying to cultivate. It was oddly gratifying to realize that Vanessa's attempt to diminish her had backfired so completely, creating opportunities and connections that wouldn't have emerged otherwise. The following weeks blurred together in the busy way that happens when you're learning new systems and meeting new people, and trying to build credibility in a fresh context. Rebecca spent her office days at Aurora getting oriented, learning the company's methodology and culture, sitting in on client meetings to understand the challenges they were trying to solve. She spent her home days designing the framework for the consulting practice, drawing on everything she had learned at Meridian, but updating it for a different kind of company with different values. Owen adjusted to the new rhythm with the Resilience Children show when change is explained clearly, and their basic security remains intact. He liked that his mom seemed happier, more energized in ways he could sense even if he couldn't articulate them. She started bringing him to the Aurora offices occasionally on days when school was closed, and he would set up at an empty desk with his homework or his art supplies while she worked. The staff treated him with friendly respect rather than the annoyed tolerance she had experienced at Meridian, where children in the office were seen as evidence of poor planning rather than just normal life circumstances. Thanksgiving approached, and for the first time in her adult life, Rebecca didn't receive an invitation to the family gathering at Linda's house. She waited for the email or text that usually came in early November, laying out times and who was bringing what dishes. When nothing arrived by mid-month, she realized the exclusion was deliberate. She felt a pang of something that wasn't quite sadness, more like the recognition that a door had closed that she hadn't fully accepted was closing. Owen asked about Thanksgiving plans one evening while they were making dinner together. Rebecca had been dreading the question, worried about how to explain family fractures to a child who loved simply and expected the adults in his life to do the same. But when she told him they weren't going to Nana's this year, that they would have their own quiet celebration instead, he simply nodded and asked if they could make homemade apple pie because the store-bought ones never tasted as good. They spent Thanksgiving morning volunteering at a community dinner in Portland's East Bayside neighborhood, serving meals to people who didn't have family to gather with or couldn't afford elaborate celebrations. Owen took the task seriously, ladling mashed potatoes onto plates with careful attention, and wishing every person a happy Thanksgiving with genuine warmth. Rebecca watched him and felt something shift in her understanding of what mattered. This was better than sitting at Linda's table managing Vanessa's barbs and her mother's pointed silences. This was choosing connection over obligation, generosity over performance. They returned home in the early afternoon and made their own small feast, just a chicken instead of a turkey because there were only 2 of them, but with all the traditional sides prepared carefully. They ate at their small kitchen table with candles lit and music playing softly in the background. Owen talked about his friends at school and the book he was reading and whether he should try out for the school play in the spring. Rebecca listened and contributed and felt more grateful than she could remember feeling in years. December brought the first real snow, heavy wet flakes that accumulated quickly and transformed Portland into something softer and quieter. Rebecca's consulting work at Aurora was going well, the initial projects exceeding expectations and generating interest from other divisions who wanted similar support. James sent her an email proposing an expansion of her role and an increase in hours if she was interested, essentially offering her a path back to full-time leadership without the toxic elements that had driven her away from Meridian. She was considering how to respond when her phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up at the last second. A woman's voice came through, professional and slightly uncertain. "Is this Rebecca Foster? I'm calling from the Maine Women's Leadership Conference. We're organizing our spring event, and we'd like to invite you to speak on a panel about career transitions and professional resilience." Rebecca was momentarily confused about how they had gotten her name, until the caller explained that James Mitchell had suggested her as someone whose story would resonate with their audience. Apparently he had shared a general outline of her journey, the corporate success followed by personal crisis followed by intentional rebuilding, and the conference organizers thought it represented exactly the kind of narrative they wanted to highlight. Rebecca agreed to think about it and asked for more details to be sent via email. That evening she mentioned the invitation to Owen while they were clearing dinner dishes. He asked what a panel was, and she explained it was like a group conversation on stage where people shared experiences and answered questions from an audience. "Would you talk about Aunt Vanessa and the dinner?" he asked with the direct curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to avoid uncomfortable topics. Rebecca paused, considering. "I might talk about family complexity and professional setbacks and what it takes to rebuild. I wouldn't use names or focus on blame, but I would be honest about the fact that sometimes the people closest to you don't see your value until someone else points it out." Owen absorbed this with a thoughtful expression, and then asked if he could come watch her speak. The question caught her off guard, but she agreed immediately, realizing that letting him see her in that context, claiming her expertise and owning her story publicly, might be one of the most important gifts she could offer him. Christmas came and went with the same quiet intentionality they had brought to Thanksgiving. Rebecca and Owen drove up the coast to Acadia National Park on Christmas Eve, hiking to Jordan Pond and taking photos of the frozen landscape. They stayed overnight at a small inn in Bar Harbor and opened presents in their room on Christmas morning. Just the two of them and a stack of carefully chosen gifts that emphasized thought over expense. Owen gave her a frame drawing he had been working on for weeks, a detailed sketch of their apartment building with lights glowing in the windows and the words "Home is where you matter" written in small letters at the bottom. Rebecca held the picture and felt tears threatening. She had spent so many years measuring success by external metrics, salaries and titles, and the approval of people who had never really seen her. Looking at Owen's drawing, she understood that she had already accomplished the thing that mattered most. She had created a space where they both felt safe and valued, where love wasn't conditional on performance or productivity. Everything else, the career rebuilding and the professional validation and even James's intervention at the dinner, those were wonderful additions, but they weren't the foundation. This was the foundation. This small fierce love between mother and child that had survived everything and emerged stronger. January brought the Maine Women's Leadership Conference, held at a hotel in downtown Portland with views of Casco Bay. Rebecca stood backstage with the other panelists, professional women from various industries who had all navigated significant career challenges. They introduced themselves and chatted nervously while waiting to go on, and Rebecca felt the familiar flutter of performance anxiety she remembered from her Meridian days. Then she looked out into the audience and spotted Owen sitting in the third row next to James Mitchell, both of them giving her enthusiastic thumbs up, and the nervousness settled into something more like anticipation. The panel went well, better than she had expected. The moderator asked thoughtful questions, and the other panelists shared stories that were both vulnerable and instructive. When it was Rebecca's turn to speak, she talked about the difference between failure and transition, about choosing values over optics, about the people who had supported her rebuilding and the people who hadn't, and why both taught her important lessons. She didn't name Vanessa or detail the dinner, but she spoke honestly about family complexity and the pain of being diminished by people who were supposed to champion you. During the question and answer portion, a woman in the audience stood and said she had been following Rebecca's career since her Meridian days, had heard through professional networks about the circumstances that led to her departure and her return to Maine. "I just want to say that watching you rebuild with integrity has been more inspiring than any of the success stories about people who climbed the ladder without ever falling off. You showed us what resilience actually looks like when it's not packaged for social media." The room erupted in applause, and Rebecca felt Owen's pride radiating from his seat like a physical force. After the panel concluded, several audience members approached to continue conversations or ask for contact information. One of them was Tom, her father, who had apparently driven up from Cape Elizabeth without telling anyone he was coming. He stood at the edge of the small crowd waiting patiently, And when she finally reached him, his eyes were wet. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "I should have said that more often when you were growing up. I should have said it every day." They hugged, an awkward embrace made genuine by its rarity and sincerity. Tom met Owen and shook his hand with grandfatherly formality, asked about school and interests and plans. They went to lunch together at a small restaurant near the waterfront, 3 generations spanning the distance that silence had created. Tom asked Rebecca about her work at Aurora and listened with real attention to her answers. He asked Owen about his drawing and seemed genuinely interested in the response. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, just a quiet recalibration of relationship, but it felt significant in its steadiness. Spring arrived gradually, winter releasing its grip one soggy day at a time until suddenly the trees were budding and the air carried hints of warmth. Rebecca had been at Aurora for 6 months now, and the consulting division she was building had exceeded every projection James had set. They were getting referrals from satisfied clients, hiring additional consultants to manage the workload, being featured in industry publications as an example of how to scale professional services without sacrificing values. She felt proud of what they were creating, but more than that, she felt aligned in ways she hadn't since her early years at Meridian, before ambition and survival had become indistinguishable. One Saturday in April, she took Owen to Bug Light Park in South Portland, the place where his favorite photo had been taken the previous spring. They walked along the waterfront path, watching boats navigate the channel, seabirds wheeling overhead. Owen was quieter than usual, processing something he hadn't yet found words for. Rebecca waited, giving him space to arrive at whatever he needed to say. "Mom," he finally asked, "are you happy now?" The question was simple but carried weight, the accumulation of all the changes and challenges he had witnessed in his young life. Rebecca stopped walking and turned to face him, wanting him to see her expression when she answered, "Yeah, buddy, I really am. Not because everything is perfect or because all the hard things went away, but because I figured out what actually matters and I'm building my life around that instead of around what other people think I should want." Owen nodded slowly, satisfied with the answer in ways that transcended the specific words. They continued walking until they reached the lighthouse at the park's edge, painted white and red against the blue sky. Rebecca took a photo of Owen standing beside it, backlit by afternoon sun, growing taller every day. She thought about sending it to the family group chat, then decided against it. Some moments were meant to be kept close, protected from the scrutiny of people who couldn't see their value. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and she glanced at it expecting spam. Instead, she saw a message from Vanessa, the first direct contact in 4 months. "I saw your panel talk was written up in the Portland Press Herald business section. Congratulations." That's all it said. No apology or explanation or invitation to further conversation. Just an acknowledgement that Rebecca had achieved something worth noting. Rebecca read the text twice, felt Owen watching her face for cues about how to interpret whatever had just arrived. She pocketed the phone without responding and took her son's hand. They walked back toward the parking lot as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would be gone in an hour. She thought about all the versions of success she had chased and all the people whose approval she had courted and how none of it compared to this, walking beside her child in comfortable silence while the world turned beautiful around them. That evening after Owen had gone to bed, Rebecca pulled out the leather notebook James had given her years ago at Meridian, the one with "Remember who you are when you forget why you started" written on the first page. She flipped through pages filled with meeting notes and strategy sketches, and occasional personal reflections from a version of herself that felt both familiar and distant. On a fresh page near the back, she wrote a single sentence in careful script. "Success is building a life that doesn't require forgiveness for being lived authentically." She closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf, a record of where she had been and a reminder of where she was going. Tomorrow she would return to Aurora and continue building the consulting practice. She would have coffee with Patricia and review project proposals with James and mentor the new hires who were just learning what ethical leadership looked like in practice. She would pick Owen up from school and help with homework and make dinner and do all the ordinary things that constituted a life worth living. The dinner where Vanessa had tried to diminish her felt like it belonged to a different era now, not because time had passed but because Rebecca had changed in fundamental ways. She no longer needed external validation to know her own value. She no longer waited for family members to see her clearly before believing she deserved to be seen. She had found her people, the ones who showed up consistently and treated her with respect, and celebrated her successes without needing to diminish them to feel better about themselves. And more importantly, she had become someone who could offer that same steady presence to others, creating ripples of impact that extended far beyond what Vanessa had tried to contain in her narrow narrative. Rebecca turned off the lights and moved through the apartment one last time, checking that doors were locked and Owen was sleeping peacefully. Through the window, Portland stretched out below in patterns of light and shadow, people living their lives in all the complicated ways that humans do. Somewhere in this city, Vanessa was probably scrolling through social media or planning her next career move, or telling someone a story in which she was the hero. But that was no longer Rebecca's concern. She had her own story now, one that didn't require anyone else to play the villain. And that felt like the truest success of all. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made Portland's waterfront come alive. Tourists flooding the Old Port District and locals claiming their favorite spots along the Eastern Promenade before the afternoon crowds arrived. Rebecca had fallen into a rhythm with her work at Aurora Digital that felt sustainable in ways her Meridian career never had. She was leading a team of 6 consultants now, traveling occasionally to client sites but mostly working from the office or home depending on what the day required. The expansion of the consulting division had exceeded even James's optimistic projections, and they were already discussing what year 2 might look like in terms of scope and staffing. Owen had finished 6th grade with solid grades and a growing confidence that showed in how he carried himself, shoulders back and voice steady when he talked about his interests or defended his opinions. He had auditioned for the school play in the spring, and landed a small role that required him to deliver 3 lines with comic timing. Rebecca had attended all 4 performances, watching from the audience as her son inhabited a character and made people laugh, comfortable being seen in ways she was still learning herself. The main summer stretched long and generous, and they took advantage of it, driving to different beaches on weekends and hiking trails they hadn't explored before. Rebecca had started dating someone she met through Aurora, a project manager named Marcus who had kind eyes and an easy laugh and no interest in games or drama. It was early still, nothing serious enough to involve Owen beyond casual mentions, but it felt healthy in ways that made her recognize how unhealthy her marriage had been. Marcus asked questions and listened to answers, shared his own vulnerabilities without making them her responsibility to fix, and respected boundaries without making her feel demanding for having them. One Saturday in July, Rebecca received an invitation in the mail that surprised her. It was from Linda, formal cardstock announcing a 70th birthday celebration to be held at the house in Cape Elizabeth. The invitation listed both Rebecca and Owen by name, which felt significant given the months of silence that had preceded it. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of the distance or explanation for the renewed contact, just the printed details and an RSVP card to return by mail like this was a wedding rather than a family gathering. Rebecca held the invitation for a long time, turning it over in her hands and considering what accepting might mean. Part of her wanted to decline, to maintain the boundary she had established and protect herself and Owen from potential hurt. But another part, the part that still carried some hope for repair despite everything, thought maybe enough time had passed that Linda had gained perspective. She asked Owen what he thought and he shrugged with the studied indifference of almost 12, said he would go if she wanted to but was equally fine staying home. She called Tom to get a better sense of what the gathering might actually involve. Her father answered on the second ring and seemed genuinely pleased to hear from her. They had been in touch more regularly since the leadership conference, brief calls every few weeks that didn't cover anything profound but maintained connection in steady increments. When she asked about Linda's birthday party, Tom was quiet for a moment before responding carefully. "Your mother has been different these past few months. I wouldn't say she's had some grand realization, but she's been asking questions about your work and mentioning things she's read about Aurora Digital. I think seeing you succeed publicly in ways she can't dismiss has complicated her narrative." He paused, then added, "Vanessa will be there, obviously. But your mother made it clear to everyone that this is a family event, and she expects people to behave accordingly. I can't promise it won't be awkward, but I don't think you'll be ambushed." Rebecca appreciated his honesty and his attempt to set realistic expectations without either pressuring her to attend or validating avoidance. She told him she would think about it and let him know, then spent the next few days weighing her options. Finally she decided to accept, Not because she expected any dramatic reconciliation, but because Owen deserved to have grandparents in his life if that relationship could be managed without toxicity, and because she had reached a point where other people's bad behavior didn't threaten her sense of self the way it once had. The party was on a Sunday afternoon in late July, and Rebecca drove to Cape Elizabeth with Owen beside her and a carefully chosen gift in the back seat. She had selected a leather photo album and filled it with pictures spanning Linda's 70 years, images Rebecca had collected from various relatives and old family files. It had taken considerable effort to assemble, but it felt like the right gesture, acknowledging Linda's life without pretending their relationship was something it wasn't. The house looked exactly as Rebecca remembered, a sprawling colonial with perfectly maintained landscaping, and that particular New England aesthetic that suggested old money even when the money was actually quite recent. Cars lined the circular driveway and street beyond, more people than Rebecca had anticipated. She felt her stomach tighten as she parked, but Owen reached over and squeezed her hand briefly before unbuckling his seatbelt, a reversal of their usual roles that made her smile despite her nerves. They walked to the front door together and Tom answered before they could knock, pulling Rebecca into a hug that lasted longer than usual. He shook Owen's hand and complimented his button-down shirt, asked about summer reading for school, making small talk that gave Rebecca a moment to adjust to being back in this space. The house was full of people, relatives and family friends mixing in clusters throughout the first floor. Rebecca recognized most of them, received polite greetings and curious looks, the unspoken questions about where she had been and what had transpired hovering in the air like humidity. Linda was holding court in the living room, seated in what Rebecca privately thought of as her throne, an antique wingback chair positioned to command the room. She looked elegant in a pale blue dress, her hair freshly styled and jewelry understated but expensive. When she saw Rebecca and Owen, something flickered across her face too quickly to identify before her hostess' smile settled into place. She stood and crossed the room with her arms extended, embracing Rebecca in a way that felt performative for their audience but not entirely false. "I'm glad you came," Linda said, and Rebecca heard layers in the simple statement. Glad for appearances, glad for whatever complicated emotion had prompted the invitation, maybe even genuinely glad in ways Linda herself didn't fully understand. Rebecca handed her the wrapped photo album and Linda opened it there in front of everyone, flipping through pages slowly while guests gathered to look over her shoulder. Several people commented on photos they hadn't seen in years, memories surfacing in exclamations and laughter. "This is beautiful," Linda said finally, and her eyes when they met Rebecca's held something that might have been gratitude or might have been recognition of the effort such a gift required. "Thank you." She set the album carefully on the side table and turned to Owen, asking about his summer with the particular attention grandmothers deploy when trying to make up for lost time without acknowledging the loss. Vanessa arrived an hour later with Craig in tow, both of them dressed like they were attending a corporate function rather than a family party. Rebecca saw her sister scan the room, register her presence, and make a visible decision about how to handle the situation. Vanessa approached with Craig slightly behind her, a formation that suggested either support or escape route depending on how things went. She stopped a respectful distance away and offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rebecca, good to see you." The words were formal, almost stilted, and Rebecca recognized them as the product of careful consideration rather than spontaneous warmth. She responded in kind, keeping her tone neutral and her body language open but not inviting. They stood together for an awkward moment before Vanessa added, "I heard the consulting division at Aurora is doing really well. James mentioned it at a leadership meeting last month." The mention of James was interesting, suggesting that Vanessa's relationship with her CEO had evolved since the dinner incident. Rebecca wondered what conversations had happened in the intervening months, what feedback Vanessa might have received about her behavior and her patterns. She thanked Vanessa for the comment and asked polite questions about her work, and they managed several minutes of surface conversation before Craig pulled Vanessa away to greet other guests. The afternoon unfolded with the particular rhythm of family gatherings where everyone is trying slightly too hard to demonstrate that everything is fine. People ate catered food and drank wine and told stories about Linda's younger years, the tales growing more embellished with each retelling. Owen gravitated toward the younger cousins, and Rebecca watched him integrate into their group with an ease she envied. Children's capacity for being present, without carrying historical baggage, making their interactions lighter than the adults around them. Tom found Rebecca on the back patio where she had stepped out for air and a moment of quiet. He handed her a glass of iced tea and leaned against the railing beside her, both of them looking out at the garden Linda maintained with almost aggressive perfection. "Your mother asked me this morning if I thought you would come. When I said I wasn't sure, she got this look on her face like she was realizing she might have waited too long to extend the invitation. I think it scared her a little, the idea that you might have moved on enough that family events weren't something you needed anymore." Rebecca considered this, turning the glass in her hands and watching condensation drip onto the patio stones. "I have moved on in a lot of ways. But that doesn't mean I don't want connection. Just that I'm only interested in connection that's honest and reciprocal. I'm not going to pretend everything is fine or accept scraps of acknowledgement and call it love. But I also don't need to punish anyone. I can show up and be civil and let people meet me where they're able." Tom nodded slowly, processing her words with the deliberate consideration he brought to most things. "I regret that I didn't model better boundaries for you girls when you were growing up. I let your mother's moods dictate too much, and I let Vanessa's behavior slide because addressing it felt like too much work. You learned to accommodate and Vanessa learned to take advantage, and I just told myself I was keeping the peace when really I was just avoiding discomfort." The admission hung between them, honest and painful and more than Tom usually offered. Rebecca reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. Acceptance without absolution. Acknowledgement without pretending the past could be rewritten. They stood together in companionable quiet until Owen appeared at the door asking if they had any food allergies because Nana was about to serve birthday cake and wanted to make sure everyone could eat it. The cake ceremony brought everyone together in the dining room, an elaborate construction of layers and frosting that must have cost a small fortune. Linda blew out candles while people sang and applauded, and for a moment Rebecca could see her mother as just a woman turning 70, measuring her life in relationships and wondering what her legacy would be. It softened something in Rebecca's chest, not forgiveness exactly but a kind of compassionate understanding that people did the best they could with the emotional tools they had, and sometimes their best was deeply flawed. As guests began to leave, Rebecca and Owen helped carry dishes to the kitchen and pack up leftover food. It was the kind of quiet service she had always provided at family events, invisible labor that kept gatherings running smoothly. But this time Linda noticed, stopped her with a hand on her arm and said simply, "Thank you for being here today. It means more than you probably realize." The words were quiet enough that no one else heard, a private acknowledgement that felt more valuable than any public declaration could have been. Driving home as the sun set over Casco Bay, Owen asked if they would be going to more family events now. Rebecca glanced at him in the rearview mirror and saw genuine curiosity rather than anxiety in his expression. "Think so, yeah. But we'll take it one event at a time and see how it goes. If it stops feeling healthy, we can step back. Family is important, but it's not worth sacrificing our peace for." He nodded and returned to the book he had brought, satisfied with an answer that acknowledged complexity without demanding certainty. August brought a heat wave that had everyone seeking shade and air conditioning, productivity slowing to match the thick air. Rebecca worked from home more during those weeks, grateful for the flexibility her role at Aurora provided. She and Marcus had dinner twice that month, conversations growing deeper as they moved past surface getting to know you exchanges into territory that required more vulnerability. He told her about his own divorce 5 years earlier, the slow process of rebuilding trust in himself and others. She shared pieces of her story, the Meridian years and the marriage that had unraveled and the sister who had tried to define her as failure. Marcus listened without trying to fix or minimize, and when she finished talking he said something that landed with unexpected weight. "It sounds like you've done the hard work of figuring out who you are when nobody else is watching. That's rare. Most people never get there because it's too uncomfortable to sit with yourself long enough to find out what's actually true underneath all the stories." Rebecca felt seen in a way that made her chest tight, recognition from someone who had no obligation to offer it beyond basic human decency. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the particular golden light that made New England autumns famous. Owen started 7th grade with new teachers and new challenges, navigating the social complexity of middle school with generally good humor. Rebecca's consulting team at Aurora took on their biggest client yet, a healthcare system trying to overhaul their operational structure without disrupting patient care. The project would span 18 months and require careful coordination, exactly the kind of challenge she had been training for throughout her career. James pulled her aside one afternoon in late September and asked if she would consider taking on a VP title formally, recognition of the work she was already doing and the leadership she had demonstrated. The offer came with a significant salary increase and equity in the company, the kind of package that would provide financial security she hadn't had since leaving Meridian. Rebecca accepted with gratitude, but without the desperate relief she might have felt years earlier. The title was nice, the money would help, but her sense of worth no longer depended on external validation in ways that made such offers feel like rescue. October brought the anniversary of the dinner, a full year since Vanessa had tried to humiliate her and James had intervened. Rebecca didn't mark the occasion consciously, but she noticed the date on her calendar and felt a moment of reflection about how much had changed. She was healthier physically and emotionally, more confident in her professional abilities and clearer about her personal boundaries. Owen was thriving in ways that had little to do with her family of origin, and everything to do with the stability she had worked so hard to create. The life she had built wasn't dramatic or Instagram-worthy, but it was solid and it was hers. A week before Halloween, Rebecca received an unexpected email from Vanessa. No subject line, just a few paragraphs that had clearly taken considerable effort to compose. The message acknowledged that Vanessa had been cruel at the dinner, and in countless smaller ways throughout their lives. It admitted that jealousy and insecurity had driven behavior Vanessa wasn't proud of, and that watching Rebecca succeed despite rather than because of family support had forced some uncomfortable self-examination. The email didn't ask for forgiveness or attempt to minimize what had happened, just stated facts and owned responsibility in ways that felt genuine because they expected nothing in return. Rebecca read the email 3 times, looking for manipulation or hidden agenda and finding neither. She sat with it for 2 days before responding, wanting to make sure her reply came from a clear place rather than old patterns of rushing to smooth things over. When she finally wrote back, she thanked Vanessa for the honesty and acknowledged that healing would take time, but that she was open to rebuilding slowly if Vanessa was willing to do the work that required. She didn't promise immediate closeness or pretend that trust could be restored quickly, just offered a crack in the door that had been closed between them. Thanksgiving approached and this year the invitation came personally, Linda calling Rebecca to ask if she and Owen would join the family for dinner. The call was brief and slightly awkward, neither of them quite sure how to navigate their evolving dynamic, but it felt like progress measured in small honest steps rather than grand gestures. Rebecca accepted and asked what she could bring, falling back on practical logistics when emotion felt too complicated to address directly. The Thanksgiving gathering was smaller than previous years, just immediate family and a few close friends. Vanessa was there with Craig, both of them more subdued than Rebecca remembered from past holidays. They greeted each other with careful warmth, and Vanessa asked Owen about school with what seemed like genuine interest. The meal itself was pleasant without being magical, conversation flowing around neutral topics and shared memories that didn't carry too much weight. It wasn't the close family dynamic Rebecca had wished for as a child, but it was honest in its limitations, and that felt more valuable than false intimacy. December brought the holidays and year-end reflection, people posting their achievements and gratitudes on social media, in the annual ritual of selective memory. Rebecca found herself less cynical about it than in previous years, understanding that everyone curated their narrative to some degree, and that wasn't necessarily dishonest if you also acknowledged the harder parts in private. She posted a photo of Owen at his school concert, and an image of the Aurora team celebrating their successful year. Simple moments that captured genuine joy without pretending life was without complexity. On New Year's Eve, Marcus invited them to his place for dinner, a low-key gathering with his teenage daughter and a friend of hers. The 6 of them played board games and ate too much food and counted down to midnight with sparkling cider, and Rebecca felt the particular contentment that comes from being exactly where you want to be with people who see you clearly. Owen and Marcus's daughter got along well, joking easily and teaming up to beat the adults at charades. It wasn't a blended family and might never be, but it was connection built on choice rather than obligation, and that made it feel solid in ways blood relations sometimes didn't. When Rebecca tucked Owen into bed that night, already technically morning of the new year, he said sleepily that this had been a really good year. She kissed his forehead and agreed, grateful that he measured life in experiences rather than acquisitions, in relationships rather than achievements. She thought about where they had been 12 months earlier, sitting at the far end of that dinner table watching her sister perform cruelty for an audience, and marveled at how much had shifted, not because she had fought for it but because she had finally stopped fighting against herself. January brought new projects at Aurora and new possibilities for what her role might evolve into. James talked about eventually opening a second office and asked if Rebecca would be interested in leading the expansion, building a team from the ground up with the benefit of everything they had learned in Portland. The idea was exciting and terrifying in equal measure, the kind of opportunity she would have killed for at Meridian but could now evaluate clearly in terms of what it would cost and whether that cost was worth paying. She told James she needed time to consider it, to talk with Owen and Marcus and sit with the decision long enough to understand what she actually wanted rather than what she thought she should want. He respected that without making her feel like the opportunity would evaporate if she didn't grab it immediately, and she appreciated his trust in her decision-making process. That trust felt like the real measure of professional relationship, the willingness to let people move at their own pace, rather than pressuring them into choices that served someone else's timeline. February was quiet, the kind of month where nothing dramatic happened but small good things accumulated. Owen made the school's soccer team and came home exhausted and happy from practices. Marcus met Rebecca's father over coffee, and they discovered a shared interest in woodworking, spending an hour discussing techniques and tools with the enthusiasm of people who had found unexpected common ground. Vanessa sent a text asking if Rebecca wanted to get coffee sometime. No agenda attached, just an offer of time together. They met on a Saturday morning at Speckled Axe, the same place they had confronted each other a year earlier. This time the conversation was different, more halting but also more honest. Vanessa talked about the work she had been doing with a therapist, examining patterns she had learned from Linda and perpetuated without questioning. Rebecca shared pieces of her own therapy journey, the work of unlearning codependency and people-pleasing. They didn't become best friends or erase the hurt that had accumulated over decades, but they sat together for 90 minutes and talked like two people trying to understand each other rather than win an argument. Spring returned with its annual promise of renewal, and Rebecca found herself thinking less about what she had lost and more about what she had gained. The consulting practice at Aurora was stable and growing, her team was functioning well, her relationship with Marcus was deepening at a pace that felt sustainable. Owen was flourishing into a person she genuinely liked, not just loved out of obligation but enjoyed spending time with. Her relationship with her parents was never going to be what she might have wished, but it was honest now in ways that felt more valuable than the false closeness they had pretended at before. One evening in late April, Rebecca sat at her desk reviewing the proposal for Aurora's expansion, while Owen did homework at the kitchen table. Her phone buzzed with a text from James asking if she had any thoughts on the timeline. No pressure but curiosity about where her thinking had landed. She looked at the proposal and then at Owen, measuring the opportunity against the life they had built so carefully. Then she opened her laptop and began composing a response that outlined how she might approach the expansion, if they structured it to preserve the flexibility that made her current role sustainable. It wasn't a yes or a no, just a thoughtful exploration of what might be possible, if they were creative about solving the logistical challenges. As she wrote, Rebecca realized that this was what success actually looked like for her now, not grabbing every opportunity out of fear or ambition, but carefully evaluating each possibility against her values and choosing consciously rather than reactively. Some people might see that as settling or playing small, but she had learned that building a life you didn't need to escape from was actually the grandest ambition of all. The document she sent James that night was thorough and honest, proposing a structure that would let her lead the expansion without sacrificing the pieces of her life that mattered most. He responded within an hour with enthusiasm and willingness to work within her parameters, trusting that her conditions came from wisdom, rather than limitation. That trust, earned through consistent demonstration of competence and character, felt like the professional relationship she had always wanted, but hadn't known how to build, until she learned to trust herself first. Rebecca closed her laptop and joined Owen at the kitchen table, helping him with math homework that was advancing beyond her easy comprehension. They worked through problems together, and she noticed how he explained concepts he understood in ways that made them accessible, patient with her confusion without making her feel stupid. He had learned that from somewhere, that generosity of spirit, and she hoped at least part of it came from watching her navigate challenges without pretending they didn't exist. That night after Owen was asleep, Rebecca stood at her apartment window looking out at Portland's scattered lights. The city quiet in the particular way that Tuesday nights are quiet. She thought about the dinner 15 months earlier and how terrified she had been that Vanessa's words might be true, that her life might actually be the failure her sister had portrayed. She thought about James standing up and telling a different story, one where her choices had meant something beyond her own survival. And she thought about all the small decisions since then that had brought her to this moment, standing in a home she had built through her own effort, surrounded by evidence that she had figured out what mattered. Success looked different now than it had when she was climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian, but it felt more solid, more earned, more truly hers. The validation didn't come from titles or salaries or other people's recognition, though those things were nice when they appeared. It came from looking at her life and recognizing that she had built something worth protecting, something that didn't require constant defense or explanation because its value was self-evident to the people who mattered. Rebecca picked up her phone and opened the text thread with Vanessa. She typed a simple message. "Coffee again next month? I'd like to hear more about what you're working on." The olive branch was small and didn't promise more than she could deliver, but it was genuine in its offering. Vanessa responded almost immediately with a yes and a date suggestion, and Rebecca felt something that might have been hope or might just have been acceptance that healing happens slowly when it happens at all. The future stretched ahead full of ordinary possibility, work to do and relationships to tend and a child to raise into someone who knew his worth without needing anyone else to confirm it. Rebecca returned to the window and watched the city breathe, lights flickering on and off as people lived their private lives in ways she would never know. Somewhere in one of those lit windows, someone was probably struggling with their own version of her story, trying to figure out how to be both soft and strong, how to maintain connection without losing yourself, how to succeed without sacrificing every principle you claim to value. She hoped they figured it out, found their own version of James stepping forward to name their worth when everyone else tried to diminish it. But more than that, she hoped they learned what she had learned, that the most important validation comes from within, from knowing you showed up honestly and did your best, and refused to let anyone else write your story for you. That was the real success, the kind that couldn't be taken away because it didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. And that, Rebecca thought as she finally turned away from the window, was worth everything she had gone through to find it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.